It's going down, and you're invited for what they selling. We ain't buying, there is no running, there is no hiding, there's only fighting or dying. It's going down, and you're invited for what they selling. We ain't buying, there is no running, there is no hiding, there's only fighting or dying.
It's Going Down is a digital community center from anarchist, anti-fascist, autonomous, anti-capitalist, and anti-colonial movements. Our mission is to provide an autonomous and resilient platform to publicize and promote revolutionary theory and action.
Go to itsgoingdown.org for daily updates. Check out our online store for ways to donate, and rate and follow us on iTunes if you like this podcast. Okay, you're listening to It's Going Down, and today we're going to be talking about two big important stories, and there's a lot to pick apart and discuss about both of these things. The first, we're going to be talking about how police departments across the U.S. are in some ways revolting. In many instances, they're taking to the streets, marching, chanting against vaccine mandates. And the ironic thing is, according to Mother Jones, actually COVID deaths are the leading cause of death so far this year for law enforcement. They're reporting, at least from this article from last month, that out of 155 police officers killed in 2021, 71 of those deaths are related to COVID-19. So we're going to be talking about, why are police pushing back against this? Is this a culture war thing? Is this another opportunity to reassert their authority in the face of largely Democratic mayors or governors or local governments? Is it all of these things? Is there something more? And then we're going to turn and look at January 6th news. There's been a lot of revelations that have come out over the past couple weeks about basically Stop the Steal activists sitting down and working directly with Republican people in Congress, them supposedly offering them pardons, and talking about what does that mean? Because as we are going into this right now, people like Tucker Carlson are kind of switching around their narratives about this whole thing, and it's getting really interesting. And as we will discuss today, this really kind of points towards where MAGAism is sort of going. But first, let's get into the police thing. Why are police opposing vaccinations? Why are they literally in New York? They're taking to the streets.
I think before we even dive into cops, I think that there's a bigger question here, right? Or like a bigger issue, which has to do with COVID itself, right? So I think anyone that actually pays attention to science in any kind of way would probably understand that, like, this is a very bad pandemic and lots of people are dying, and wearing masks really stops transmission in an incredibly effective way. And so do, not leaving your house. And that's just all simple logic, right? Like, we have precedent for the idea that masks stop the transmission of disease. We know that when fewer humans are concentrated in a place, there's less chance for infection. That's just basic logic. You don't even have to understand much about the human body to even really get that. It's way less complicated than something like climate change even, right? It's incredibly simple, and it's right in front of you all the time. I think most of us know someone or know someone who died of COVID, right? And most of us, including myself, have gotten sick with COVID, right? I got sick after being vaccinated. And I'm very careful. That just tells you how infectious this thing is. And so any person who was just looking at the information would decide, yeah, that's probably a good thing. And I don't really care whether it's a politician telling me I should wear a mask or not. The doctor is telling me that wearing a mask is a good idea, and that probably makes it a good idea. But what happened on the right was something really fascinating. It's kind of this like narrative walk. We're going to talk about again when it comes to January 6th. But at the beginning of the pandemic, Trump was saying, oh, it's not that bad. And, kind of the line amongst the people on the right wing was, oh, it's being overblown by the Democrats or trying to steal the election, blah, 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 blah. Then about midsummer, Trump was trying to distract from the uprising. He's like, look at this amazing vaccine we're making. We're going to cure this horrible disease. And so now the disease is horrible, right? But he's going to fix it. And that, I mean, if you read any of the kind of post-Trump administration books that have come out, that was all part of the campaign plan that he was going to, and tried to, force the Centers for Disease Control to approve a vaccine a week before the election, without any real testing. Then when that didn't happen, it became, oh, all these doctors are trying to make sure you stay sick. You can't trust the medical establishment, blah, 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 blah. And so what's going on there is this process in which conservatives, and specifically conservative political operatives, have figured something out that's kind of interesting. They can say whatever they want about a thing, and it doesn't have to be consistent, because conservative politics is not about politics. There are no politics in conservatism, right? All conservatism is, in the William F. Buckley sort of description, is, how do you put it? He said something along the lines of, conservatism is standing astride of history with your hands out shouting no, right? It's about being intentionally reactionary. And so what Republican strategists have figured out is that as long as there's another route to go, as long as they can keep the discourse going, then that's okay. It doesn't really matter whether or not anything that you're saying makes sense, because what's happened with information in the United States is actually kind of fascinating. And this is Mussolini talked a lot about this, right? But essentially there was this idea that arose in fascism in the 20s and 30s about delegitimizing the media. We saw something very similar play itself out during the Trump era, but it expanded. It went even further. And so it wasn't just about newspapers or radio stations. It was also about websites. It was also about random people's blogs. It was also about your aunt or uncle that you disagree with. That now anybody that's telling you something you disagree with, if you're a conservative, is wrong because you disagree with them. And so it has no bearing what is being said. All that matters is who is saying it. Now, from an epistemic perspective, that is absurd and ridiculous. And it's a reason, very clearly, why any sort of political discourse is just completely imploded in the United States. Because really, anytime anyone disagrees with anyone in the Trumpian right, they're immediately written off. So if we look at the pandemic through this light, we can actually see that narrative kind of shift in a really disturbing direction. And this kind of like sets the stage for what's going on with the police right now. We've watched as this narrative has turned, and as it's turned against the healthcare establishment, it started to talk about how doctors are tricking you. Really, the medical establishment is working with the Democrats who are communists, blah, 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 right? As that narrative built up, we also started to see things like ivermectin come into the public consciousness, hydrochloroquine, colloidal silver, these kinds of things which just, again, on a basic logical level, can't in any way have any impact on COVID. So COVID's a virus. Ivermectin is an anti-parasite drug. Parasites, and I'm sure anyone that ever took elementary school science can tell you this, parasites, not viruses. Totally different kinds of things, right? Hydrochloroquine is about malaria, which is not COVID. It's not even in the same family of pathogen. It's not even in a family that's concurrent, right? And then colloidal silver is just like a pretty consistent conspiracy theory thing. It's really bad for you if anyone's taking it. And if you take enough of it, it turns you blue. And so you can go to these like QAnon conferences now and you see people with like blue tint to their skin because they've been drinking colloidal silver for the last 6 months. Or bleach. Some of them drink bleach. But the point is that all of those treatments are, for lack of a better term, suicidal through neglect, right? We have people in this country not going to hospitals when they're deathly ill with COVID because they insist on taking horse paste to fix their disease and doctors won't give it to them. So they're staying at home and they're dying, right? It's tragic and terrible, but we see the same thing playing out with the police. And so we have to really think about what cultural role and political role the police play now. You know, like there's this mythology in the United States that police are, quote, neutral, right? Nobody's actually neutral. Everybody has actual thoughts about stuff. Neutrality would mean the literal absence of opinions, right? That's not a thing anybody can have, even simple things like choosing coffee over tea in the morning is an opinion, right? And so obviously police aren't neutral. The entirety of the philosophy behind the quote criminal justice system assumes that they are, otherwise you can't possibly justify their claim that they have more of an ability to make judgment over other people's actions than anybody else. But that issue aside, cops aren't neutral. They never have been. We can look back in American history since the advent of police departments in, the 1850s, and we can look and see where they came from. In the South, they came out of slave patrols, and in the North, they came out of, groups like the Pinkertons and stuff like that, which existed to break strikes. Those aren't neutral activities, right? Just in a very basic way. Those are not neutral activities. Those are activities which choose a side in history. And so on some level, we talked about this recently on this show. But we've been watching things like Proud Boys marching with cops. We watched, I forget where it was last week. It's either in Washington State or Oregon, I forget. A group of neo-Nazis dropped a banner off an overpass, and when the cops showed up, one of the cops fist bumped one of the Nazis on camera, right? We've got QAnon cops out there. We've got cops. I mean, there's obviously cops sharing things like racist memes about running people over with cars. All of that is already happening. And so this connection to the alt-right already exists. And so with COVID, what's fascinating about it is that I think we've watched in the US a lot of things become sort of political indicators, right? Slang language, for example, or like memes, shirts you wear, slogans you have on stuff, like even things like, American flags that are all black, like those kinds of things all have indications of sort of political value.
Yeah,
right?
Or just like crossed guns with like 1776 on them. You see that and you're just
sure.
like, oh, okay.
Yeah, or like when one of these like crazy parents gets up and talks about like mask mandates and goes, we're going to 1776 everything. Like that is right-wing slang from the militia movement from 10 years ago. So what's interesting about COVID though is that the indicators are really noticeable. If you're a person that listens to doctors, you're probably wearing a mask when you go outside, and you're probably not going out that much, and you're probably not complaining about it too much. It sucks, but it's kind of the necessary thing to do, regardless of whether governments tell you to or not. But for the right, this has all sort of wrapped itself into a strength narrative in this really weird way. So like MAGAism is all about strength. And it's all about projecting this almost comically cartoonish image of strength. There's a lot of cultural reasons why people gravitated towards that are beyond the scope of this discussion, but, it's a strength narrative, and everything about it is about never being wrong, never having to apologize, never having to be sorry for who you are, quote unquote, right? Never having to ever admit you made a mistake. But also, it's this kind of narrative in which, as we saw last summer, people are willing to put their lives at risk to project that image of strength. And so the mask in the right wing has become this image of weakness. Mandates are about politicians controlling your life, and you're weak if you listen to them, right? And all of this is wrapped now into the strength narrative of projecting power that literally forms the foundations of how police organize and act in this country, which is all entirely about, as they put it in their training materials, maintaining an advantage of force. Namely, projecting power over others through their physical appearance. So when we see cops not wearing masks, even though their mayors are telling them they have to, that's not about them not believing COVID is real necessarily. That is about them projecting the image that they are the ones that are in control of this situation and that they have a specific political position that they've aligned themselves with. The amount of danger that presents, especially to those of us that live in kind of left-wing cities, is almost immeasurable. The police have chosen to side with the far right. These COVID protests are one more manifestation of that. That's really dangerous. And so though they look kind of ridiculous and hilarious and silly, though cops are literally engaging in what is essentially suicide by neglect, right? Like they're allowing themselves to get sick, they're refusing treatment, and they're dying as a result. It shows us two things. One, everything us anarchists have been saying for a long time about the police is true. You can't trust them and they take a side. And it's not our side. But two, this is a clear expression of how Trumpism is becoming a death cult, not just a regular cult, not just like a closed bubble ecosystem with mechanisms of intellectual control, but is actually now tending towards people voluntarily dying. And on top of the danger of the police aligning themselves with this, the fact that people are voluntarily dying, as opposed to engaging in something which might indicate that their former political positions were wrong, it's just really sad and tragic. And it's happening more and more all the time.
The other question to ask is, where is this going to go? I mean, if police are literally marching through the streets now, and on November 1st, supposedly we're going to see the start of some of these mandates where city workers and public employees are at least supposed to have the first injection. What are we going to see? Are we going to see like cops quit in mass? Are we going to see strikes? This seems to be something that will come to a head.
Yeah, we might see both of those things. Now, keep in mind, in most states, there are laws against cops going on strike. They're considered essential workers, and in a lot of states, they can't strike. Now, that doesn't mean they won't try, but the penalties for doing so are really, really, really high. And the reality is that most of these people don't actually feel this strongly about this. It's not about COVID. It's about the cultural indicator. And so if they can reasonably find a way to opt out and say, oh, I was forced to do this, I got to feed my kids, blah, like they're going to get the vaccine. Like they just are. Most of them. Now, some of them will take a stand and quit. Some of them will get fired. We're already seeing this with healthcare workers, right? But I think the healthcare industry is actually really illustrative here. Because in the healthcare industry, there were hundreds of thousands of healthcare workers that were refusing to get vaccinated when the mandates were announced. When they went into effect, a few thousand ended up actually losing their jobs. Meaning that the vast majority of them were like, well, I guess I'm going to go get vaccinated now. And they just went and did it. That's probably going to replicate itself with most of the police. A lot of the cops that you're seeing out there at these protests, like take a city like New York, right? Like there was a march yesterday in New York. It was like, I don't know, a few hundred people, maybe 500, maybe 600. Not all of those were public service workers, and not all the public service workers were cops. Okay. So you take that crowd of 500-600 people, say half of them are public service workers, which is being generous here. Just looking at the crowd and being able to identify some of the people there, like half is generous. And then a lot of those people were wearing like firefighter shirts and EMS shirts. And so say half of those people were cops. Okay. So that means that there were like 150, 200 cops there. There's 40,000 police in New York. So like, just like with the alt-right, there's a small number of these cops that are doing this thing, and it definitely indicates a much, 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 much larger problem. But as far as them being able to mobilize some sort of collective action, you'll probably see some of that, but it's not going to be all that disruptive, I don't think. The other thing to keep in mind too is that there are internal divisions within police departments, and this kind of drift towards the right is, well, I wouldn't even say drift towards the right. The making obvious of right-wing sympathies, right? Cops have always been on the right wing, but the making obvious of right-wing sympathies that has been happening is largely confined to white cops. In a lot of major cities, police departments are not even majority white anymore. And within those departments, I live in a city like this, there is really deep divisions inside the police department. And cops that are not white have organized their own, trade unions and are organizing their own labor organizations and organizing their own political endorsement programs and stuff like that because they don't want anything to do with, in the case of this city, the Patrolman Benevolent Association. That's also the case everywhere else in every other city in the country. And so in small towns, you might see some of this, right? In small towns, you might see cops try and shut down a police department for the day or whatever. In the big cities where a lot of these protests are concentrated, the reality is a lot of these people are going to back down. Some of them will quit. We've already been seeing cops quit. Like ever since last summer, retirement rates and rates of people leaving their jobs in police departments in urban areas in this country have shot through the roof. And the recruitment classes have gotten smaller. And so as that happens, the more forcefully the cops try and manifest this, the more resentment they're just going to build. We're already seeing that in New York. where the cops are trying to manifest this, say, take that video from the subway, like last week. Some guy filmed 2 cops, NYPD, transportation cops in the subway. By law, they have to be wearing masks. They weren't. Guy went up and asked them why they weren't, and the cops grabbed him and threw him through a turnstile. Right? Just without any reason. It's not like the guy was coming at them or something. He was very politely asking them why they weren't wearing masks, and they decided to physically assault this guy. Right? Not the way to build goodwill. And so we can learn things from things like the war in Iraq, right? When occupying forces lose hearts and minds, their occupation doesn't last very long. And we saw last summer what happens when the cops lose hearts and minds. And we're watching them now, pretty much with this sort of series of actions around COVID, decide that they just don't care anymore. Decide that they're going to try and continue this drift to the right, and they're going to try and manifest their power through force. That is actually the thing that is going to have the longer term impact. This is more indicative of a mentality shift in police departments, where they're no longer trying to even care about cooperating with people. Now their only job is to project force and strength, and to be an institution which holds power purely through those means. That's not anything different from what policing is in general. And things like community policing are sort of mythologies, right? Which are really attempts to get communities to inform on themselves, to be snitches, right? But really underlying all those programs is the reality that a police department is an occupying force with guns. And their job is to impose the will of the political class in that process. What we're watching here with this COVID stuff is, to a degree, them choosing a political class to ally themselves with, and then the mask of their sort of legitimacy getting ripped completely off. That's the part that's going to continue. Like, we're going to see more and more and more of that as we go forward, I think.
Well, let's switch now to some bombshell news around January 6th. There's been a lot of articles that have come out over the past week that have just really rocked the foundations of this thing. So the first one is this big article that came out in Rolling Stone, and what it says is that in the lead up to January 6th, some people have testified that are facing charges that they met dozens of times with members of the GOP that are in Congress. This includes people like Paul Gosar, Bobart, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and other people that are sort of in kind of the MAGA world far-right orbit close to Trump. And they even went so far as to say that Paul Gosar, basically speaking on behalf of people connected to Trump in the Oval Office, said that they would receive blanket pardons for their role in overthrowing the election, essentially.
So let's start with what's going on. We have to think of this all in the context of the January 6th Commission. So, we've been talking about how the January 6th Commission isn't going to actually result in anyone going to jail. I think that's really obvious. However, there is going to be a result, and that result is starting to show itself. We're going to get a report, and that report is probably going to be a lot more extensive than most of us thought it would be at the beginning. There's more people cooperating than I think a lot of us anticipated would. And those people are coming with things like financial records, and they're coming with things like communications records. They're dropping documents on Congress, and those documents are pretty damning. That is going to potentially get really interesting. Before we were recording this, we were talking about the trial going on in Charlottesville, and how one of the things that's happening down there is that the financial networks that were responsible for funding Unite the Right, and the alt-right in general, are getting exposed in the process of that trial. There are always these weird questions like, how did the Daily Stormer get $250,000 in Bitcoin 3 days before Unite the Right happened? Where did that money come from? It's a lot of money. Nick Fuentes got a similar amount of money in Bitcoin right before January 6th, right? There's a lot of questions that have to get asked at that point. And so there's all of these questions of who's funding what, who knows who's doing this, who's doing that. All of that's going to end up in the report. Now, the second thing that's happening, though, is that in the meantime, as these people are dropping these documents, they're also going to the press. And ironically, right? So I want to point this out, okay? These are hard right-wing activists, Okay, a lot of these people, like Katrina Pearson is a name that comes up a lot. Katrina Pearson is former Trump campaign spokeswoman. She's the one that, if you ever saw a picture of a lady wearing a necklace made out of bullets, that's Katrina Pearson. Her roots actually go back to the Tea Party. And she was a Tea Party activist in like the 2010-2011 era and sort of moved up through the ranks. A lot of these other people also have their roots in kind of Tea Party organizations, or at least the groups that they work for do. And so these connections between a person like Mark Meadows, who was the White House chief of staff at the time, who was a Tea Party person, people like Paul Gosar, who have a lot of connections, or Andy Biggs, who have a lot of connections to people like that. It's not particularly surprising that there's a lot of crossover between their staffs and those organizers. What's interesting is what that crossover looks like. And so a lot of these people are starting to go public to the press, the same press that they decided was the literal devil just before that, to complain about how they did not get their blanket pardons. Now, where that all comes from, and there was this rumor for a while floating around, like maybe November and December, that Trump was offering blanket pardons to right-wing activists. And there was never any proof of that until, now, where there's kind of proof of that. What was said, essentially, by these organizers who are unnamed, right? So they're anonymous, but Rolling Stone's able to verify who they are, and they are definitely people who are going to testify in front of Congress. They just didn't want to identify who they were in the media, which, fair. Their claim is not only did they meet dozens of times with Republican congresspeople, not only did they try and coordinate their rally with the attempt to disrupt the vote certification inside Congress, but in that process, someone from Paul Gosar's staff was having a meeting with them and said, yeah, I mean, you're all going to get pardoned if something goes wrong. Now, where that likely came from, so reading other texts about the late Trump administration, we do know that some of these right-wing Congress people were coming into meetings in the White House after the election with people like Mark Meadows, but also people like Sidney Powell, Michael Flynn, Giuliani, people like this. By that point, Trump had kind of ostracized everybody from his orbit that wasn't willing to kind of perpetuate the lie about the election, right? And so what happened is it kind of built into this bunker mentality. And this is something you see in every one of these accounts. Even Stephanie Grisham's recent book, she talks about this, but they essentially closed in on themselves. And in that process, they built this mentality that they had ultimate power and they were going to do whatever they needed to do to keep it. And they were going to push that as far as they needed to push it. They knew, I think, at that point that they weren't going to get support from the military. That the Joint Chiefs of Staff had already sent a number of memos to the White House saying that they're a non-political institution, they're staying out of this. So what they did was they started looking towards right-wing activists to try and be their forces on the street. And in that process, Mark Meadows himself, in those meetings, was noted to have said on a number of occasions, yeah, why don't we just pardon all these people? Then they could do whatever they want. That's probably where that came from. And very likely, Paul Gosar was involved in some of those meetings as well. Very likely in a sidebar at one of those meetings, one of Paul Gosar's staff was having a discussion with Mark Meadows, and Meadows said, yeah, we'll just pardon everybody. That's probably where that came from. If that's true, that's a big problem. That proves the coup narrative at that point. Literally. That the president is willing to use the pardon as a way to absolve people from committing sedition in his name.
I want to go to Vietnam, and I'll die there if I have to. There's not going to be an America anymore unless there are people who are willing to sacrifice. I love my country, Dad. I know, buddy. I know.
Right, why? Do you know that thing? Communism has to be stopped. It's not
Fire is burning in my eyes.
government, it stops right there. The government is a bunch of corrupt thieves, they are rapists and robbers. And we are here to say that we don't have to take it anymore. We're not. We are here to say
But it shows that they are seeing the far right as one piece on the board that they're using
Yes.
for this bigger play. To me, this is where, all this talk of, the three-way fight and fascism, I mean, this is where, like, the rubber really hits the road.
Yeah.
And I feel like where we've been talking about it really starts to get scary. I mean, I don't have a fear per se that Richard Spencer is going to create an ethno-state anytime soon, or that even the local constitutional sheriff is going to rise up. But I do have a fear that those forces are going to align with corporate-backed forces in the Republican Party,
Yes.
and that they're going to form something much larger and powerful together.
Uh-huh.
And also that the state is going to weaponize and deputize those forces, especially to use against us and the broader left and emerging social movements and the wider working class as a whole, to basically push back that segment in order to hold them at bay to rise to power. And it seems very clear that that's what they tried to do on the 6th. I mean, do you have any sense of like how much they were counting on the far right to kind of show up that day, and like how much that actually played into the wider grand scheme of things?
Historically, the end of dictatorships involve a lot of self-delusion, right? I say that because that's also what happened here. There was a degree to which it became very clear that people in the White House started, taking their own supply, right? Like they started believing it. And so, it started with Trump's legal team and Giuliani coming around being like, oh, I heard this on the internet and this and this and this, and like talk Trump into this whole process of trying to get rid of, like, overthrow the election. And at the beginning, if any of these after administration accounts are to be believed, and most of them concur with each other, and so like that's a pretty good indication that what's being said is pretty accurate. But at a certain point, probably by like the beginning of December, a lot of people really started believing it, and there's a split in the White House between people who believed it, people like Mark Meadows, people like Giuliani, people like Trump, and people who didn't. People like Stephanie Grisham, people like Elaine Chao, who is Mitch McConnell's wife, but also used to be the Secretary of Transportation, right? Betsy DeVos was one of the people that didn't believe this, and so she quit as well, right? All those people, by the time they had resigned, had been marginalized completely. And they had been marginalized for weeks before that. And so what emerged in the White House was this process in which the same, like, 10 people were in a room all day, every day, building each other up, reinforcing each other's arguments. Like, that is a cult-like atmosphere. And that is how they acted, right? Now, there were a lot of tendencies before that leading in that direction. But I think there's a number of things happening at that point, though. The first is a basic reality, which is there are wealthy, incredibly wealthy people that are behind a lot of these kind of astroturfed kind of political movements on the right wing. For example, the Koch Foundation was at the time in 2010 pretty much the sole funder of Americans for Prosperity. Americans for Prosperity was more or less the sole funder of the entire Tea Party movement, including paying their staffers to go to cities all around the country to organize autonomous, organic grassroots protests, right? Which a lot of the people that showed up were like party operatives, people who were members of right-wing activist groups, blah, blah, blah. It wasn't like random people from the street, right? We move forward into 2015 and we see Robert and Rebecca Mercer funding Breitbart and really encouraging a lot of the rise of the alt-right. Now, you think that's kind of weird considering that the Mercers are, pretty Zionist, right? Like they're really, really, really heavy right-wing supporters of the Israeli state. And a lot of the people that they were bringing into the right-wing movement were Nazis. And you'd think that would be weird, right? Except we have to think back to this kind of long-running sort of structure within the conservative movement, which goes back all the way to the early 20th century, right? Where you have these thinkers who are starting, and we talked about this recently, but we're starting to talk about this notion that there were a few very smart people that needed to convince everybody else of these simple myths in order to maintain power and social structure. And that a lot of the conservative movement itself was structured on that idea. You see this with the traditional structure of the Republican Party, which is normally run by the incredibly wealthy. And they're using, historically, activists in things like, segregationist movements or the religious right or something that they don't even really have any connection to politically to build up enough political power because they themselves are an extreme minority in order to maintain their wealth. And there's a long history of the Republican Party being openly used that way. That doesn't just magically go away with the Tea Party. There's this idea that with the Tea Party, everything changed. And a lot of things did change. And I'm a person who has made the argument, and will stand by this argument, that without the Tea Party, you don't get Trumpism. However, that was sort of an inversion, an unintentional inversion of what the intent of the Tea Party was for the upper echelons of the GOP. They were using that as an attempt to mobilize people in the streets, to build a voting bloc, to gain power under a Democratic precedent, right? Did the same thing under Clinton with the impeachment. Within Trumpism, though, that relationship shifted a bit. And so you see this process in which these grassroots networks like QAnon have started to split off from that traditional structure. But then you've also got other elements of the right wing like the alt-right, or groups like the Proud Boys, or groups like the Oath Keepers, who exist in this sphere in which their funding and their sources of information are coming from, sources which are more traditionally tied to the traditional right, like the Mercer family funding Breitbart, for example. Now, why would those people fund something like Breitbart? It's really obvious. They thought that that would help keep them in power. And in a Republican Party, which is increasingly a minority political party, that's a really powerful idea. And so going into January 6th, it was clear that there were some people that were trying to use this as in a cynical attempt to hold on to power and didn't actually believe any of it. I think what's really shocking, though, is that by the time we got into December of last year, most of the main protagonists actually believed it. They legitimately believed it. Marjorie Taylor Greene level believed it, right? And that might be self-delusion. But what happened at that point, though, is that those circles of power in the Republican Party and grassroots activists fused together and took on this role of being a sort of vigilante force within American politics. That even though they were in power, they needed to keep mobilizing in order to stay there. Because if they didn't stay there, America was going to die or something, right? And people legitimately believe this. So we're watching that play out. And in this case, what's really interesting is that obviously these people didn't get pardoned. And if you look to a number, when Rolling Stone asked them why they're talking to Rolling Stone, they said, "I'm really mad I didn't get my pardon." Which is legit, right? They were told something. They took a bunch of risks based on that thing. And then the person who promised it to them didn't pull through. And that's kind of the story of Trumpism, right? How many people, Ethan Nordine from the Proud Boys, for example, right, said this during his pretrial hearing. He's like, "I was convinced that the election was stolen, that Trump was going to pardon us, and we were all fighting the good fight, and now I'm really, because I think I got lied to." Well, yeah, of course you did, dude. A little bit of critical thinking, and that would have been really, really obvious, multiple years ago before you threw your whole life away. But
who would have known that this this upstanding billionaire that's known for sexual assault
exactly
is just so out there? This is not like him.
Exactly. Well, and it really goes to show how far Trumpism has gone into the realm of self-justifying cultism. in that nothing about it makes sense to anybody outside of it. But so what this means, though, is that there's these kind of interesting splits that I think existed but weren't really obvious because there was this kind of force of Trumpism holding everybody together.
But at the same time, I mean, just to play devil's advocate, I mean, I'm assuming you're talking about stuff like at the recent QAnon conference. I think it was like Cowboys for Trump or something like that. It's always something for Trump.
Yeah.
XY identity for Trump. The guy got up there and said, I'm mad at Trump because now our guys are in prison. I thought it was going to be just black people or Antifa. But the reason I bring this up is because I think that signals the start of Trumpism beyond Trump, or them going like, how can we continue these politics outside of the man? Now, I think obviously if they lose Trump, they lose kind of that figure that will bring, especially, quote, the normies together with everybody else. But I think that they still have a lot of people that will probably continue. Mm-hmm. The question is who will be the big players and who will kind of guide the ship, I guess.
Yeah, well, and that's what remains to be seen. And I think what's happening right now is going to be highly determinative of the answer to that question in the future. So we're watching this really interesting narrative shift happen that's exposing some of these splits that are going on that were kind of subterranean, like difficult to see. If we think about the GOP narrative of January 6th, it started off as, this is a really bad thing that should never happen again. Then turned into, it wasn't that bad. It was just like a tourist trip, like with tear gas. It was fine. Totally normal. To them being able to say things like, well, it wasn't everybody. It was just a few bad people that did all of this. And, which of course gets entirely undercut when Congress people are coordinating with organizers. So now they're moving increasingly into this kind of incoherent position. Now, part of the right wing, specifically the MAGA crowd, and specifically people around Tucker Carlson, are definitely pushing full on into the Alex Jones false flag territory. Anyone that saw the trailer for Tucker Carlson's upcoming quote documentary about January 6th, it's pretty cringe. I mean, it's pretty racist uncle's blog spot from 1998 kind of cringe, right? And it's like the kind of weird stuff that even guests on Alex Jones' show wouldn't say because it's so far out there. That narrative arose at a time in which all of this news about January 6th started coming out. And what this means is that there's this distancing happening. So there's kind of three factions building up around January 6th. There's this was bad and we still think it's bad and we're not going to talk much about it, but we think it's bad. That's like the Mitch McConnells, Mitt Romneys of the world, right? Then you have this was awesome. We should totally do this again crowd, which is like militia people, like half of the Proud Boys, like people like that are pretty pumped that they did what happened and are pretty convinced that they're like soldiers for America or whatever. And they're going to keep, fighting the war against buildings or whatever they think that they're doing. And then there's this was an Antifa false flag operation. Now the problem is that you can't have all three of those things exist at the same time. And so the two positions of this was a false flag, we're going to move past this, just forget it ever happened, and this was really bad, those two can coexist, and they do, and they coexist in Congress right now. I think where you start running into problems, though, is they start running into problems around this third faction, which is also the same faction of people that refuses to participate in the political system anymore, because they're convinced that every election is rigged. There was a poll recently done in Marjorie Taylor Greene's district, which, for those of you that don't know, Marjorie Taylor Greene's district, I think it's one of the 5 most conservative House districts in the United States. I forget where in that list it falls. It's deeply, deeply, deeply conservative. It's in northern Georgia. And some people went around and were polling, recently, just like last month, asking people whether they were going to vote in the midterms. 4%, only 4%, but 4% of voters, all of which were Republicans, said that they were no longer participating in the political system even though they had before. Now, that doesn't seem like a lot. And in Marjorie Taylor Greene's district, it's not a lot. But you take a district that a Republican wins by 1,000 votes, or 2,000 votes or half a percentage point, that means a lot. That 4% swings that.
You're listening to It's Going Down, part of the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network. Follow us online at itsgoingdown.org and on Twitter at IGD_news. If you like and appreciate this podcast, go to itsgoingdown.org/shop and give us a one-time donation. Sign up to donate monthly or donate through Bitcoin. Again, that's itsgoingdown.org/shop to support. And now, back to the show.
And so we're starting to hit this point. So we've been talking a lot about how the developments in Trumpism have this possibility of completely undermining the ability of the GOP to continue to win elections. With the January 6th sort of commission and the sort of investigation around it, what's becoming really clear is that that problem is much more deep-seated than just primary contests. That this idea that people aren't going to vote in elections because all elections are stolen, is actually gaining currency. And it's gaining currency with the same group of people that we talked recently about on this show, which is the group of people that are starting to talk about secession. And so what's really, really dangerous about this, I mean, on one level, there is a very high likelihood that that will damage the electoral prospects of Republicans, right? There's even a very likely possibility that the Republican Party will end up fragmenting based on who wins the power struggle between the traditional power structure and the MAGA crowd. There might be groups that split off, and there have already been groups on either side of that divide talking about forming third parties. But you've got this whole other group that left. Now, this group is expressing something that actually is a politics really similar to the mid-90s militia movement. That's actually what scares me. The mid-90s militia movement was a kind of fascinating space because it grew without the internet, or at least mostly without the internet. There were some bulletin board systems, but most people did not have a modem, right? And it grew strangely very organically through like the gun show circuit and these kind of big events like Waco, Ruby Ridge, stuff like that. But the narrative that was being pushed in the extreme right at that point was this narrative that the U.S. government is dominated by name evil group of people. For Nazis, obviously the evil group of people was Jewish people. For a lot of other people, it was just like rich people or like corporations or satanic lizards or whatever the hell it happened to be. Like there were a lot of groups that were attributed to running the whole world or whatever. But because of that, you shouldn't participate in the political system at all. Instead, what you should do is you should band together with a bunch of people that think like you, get a bunch of guns and start a compound. Go move out to the middle of the woods. And a lot of people did that. A lot of people did that. Like you go to like Idaho or Eastern Washington State or a state like Utah or Montana, there's tons of these compounds up there. Dozens of them. Some of them are one family, some of them have multiple families on. There's a lot of them though. We are watching that happen again. The gun church, the one that, it's the son of the founder of the Unification Church, which is referred to as the Moonies, who moved to the U.S. The Moonies were started in Korea. He moved to the U.S. and he started this church, and it's very much like the Unification Church, except they take this one single passage from the Bible, I forget exactly where, that says that the job of Christians is to protect everybody with a rod of iron, and they interpret rod of iron as an AR-15. That group of people just had a conference 2 weeks ago. The QAnon Anonymous podcast actually went to the conference. It is quite a thing. But it was this mix of extreme QAnon people. Gun rights activists is not the right word. Enthusiasts, let's put it that way. Militia people, people from the racist right wing, and Christian dominionists. They were all in the same place. At the new compound that this group bought. And so we have groups buying compounds again. Those same groups are the same groups that are telling people to secede from the United States. They're the same people that are telling people not to participate in the political system. That's the group of people that gets really dangerous. Because that's the group of people that doesn't have any recourse towards anything. They feel completely disempowered. They feel completely lost. They've now been rejected by the right wing because they support what happened on January 6th and everyone else is saying it was an Antifa false flag operation or whatever, and they feel rejected, and you're starting to already hear this kind of rhetoric, like we can't have anything to do with the conservatives or Trumpism or blah, 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 because they don't really want to fight. We're the only ones that, like you're hearing that kind of rhetoric out of them. That's going to lead to a couple of things. I mean, first, again, it will damage the electoral prospects of Republicans. But secondly, and I think a lot more importantly, we're entering into a phase in which we're starting to see a lot of the dynamics of what I would consider to be the sort of 90s to mid 2000s sort of far right. So like the alt-right was really diffuse, right? People weren't really held together by much. They kind of knew each other on the internet. There wasn't really any affinity there, and it's why they were so easy to sort of decimate. The traditional right wing is a different story, though. And for those of you that have gotten involved in anti-fascist work in the last 4 or 5 years, this is really important to understand. Groups like the National Alliance, groups like the Hammerskins, groups like the Aryan Nation are not the alt-right. Those groups are made up of big, huge, strong skinheads with lots of tattoos and guns. They kill people. They shoot people. They bomb stuff. They rob banks. It's a totally different thing. A lot of those people come out of some element of like white working class street culture. The norms are totally different. A lot of those people are super paranoid and don't go on the internet, right? It's a completely different culture. And it's one that's a lot more subterranean. And it's one that in my experience is a lot more dangerous. Coming up in the early days, like it was not rare to hear, if you were talking to anti-racists in like the late 90s, to hear of people getting stabbed like every weekend in a lot of cities at the same time by members of different groups or people that weren't even members of groups. Just people with, shaved heads and swastikas on their jackets. There was a whole symbology of your shoelace colors and the colors of your suspenders and the way you wore your jeans and the way you cut your hair. There's this like whole symbology about it. It was a lot more intense. And there were a lot fewer of us back then. A lot fewer of us back then. And those people were the type of people which shot in the back of the head 2 ARA activists outside of Las Vegas in the late 90s. Right? We saw groups like the Atomwaffen Division kind of take on some of that rhetoric, but failed to actually pull through on almost anything, or a couple of things. But, they had all these plans to assassinate anti-fascists and, like, of course, organize them with someone from the FBI and everyone got arrested and, stuff like that. But these people from the far right did those things and will do them again.
This has been the It's Going Down podcast. Check itsgoingdown.org for daily updates, columns, action reports, and news. Go to itsgoingdown.org/shop to support us and follow us on all social media platforms. IGD, your daily resource for insurgent proletarian life.